Hi, this is Steve Donahoe, and this is another episode of the Walrus and the Honeybee podcast. This one's based on my blog post on my blog called The Walrus and the Honeybee, which was posted on the 26th of May 2025, called Myth Busting. I'll get on to that in a minute. But a few little updates. But first of all, of course, I'll have a sip of my tea. I was looking at the traffic to my podcasts recently. I've done 15 episodes or so far. And the top heard podcast is the one on swarm prevention, and the next one down was the one called Varroa Why Treat, but most of the rest of them are fairly level, but the swarm one stood out as quite popular, and funnily enough that's the only one where I'm speaking, I think, rather than my AI voice that I often use, Imogen, who I actually think sounds pretty good, but lots of people don't like AI for one reason or another, so I thought I'd have a go doing the real thing, the voice of the walrus. And if you don't know anything about me, basically I'm UK based, a small scale bee farmer. I have a business called Walrus Apiaries, and the Walrus name is just because I needed something catchy when I set the company up, and also I do really like the poem The Walrus and the Carpenter by Lewis Carroll, and I've also got whiskers, and occasionally I look a bit walrus-like when I'm maybe around about Christmas time. In the summer I'm sort of more like a sea lion, and in the winter I'm more like a walrus. Anyway, so a quick bit of news on spring, because we're basically just doing our spring extracting now. We haven't got that. We've got 10 or 11 apiaries, and it takes us about 10 days-ish to clear all the supers and bring them back and extract them. We're kind of like about halfway through all that. And because we had such a lovely spring, really beautiful sunny weather for so long, most beekeepers seem to be saying, what a fantastic spring, what an amazing crop. I haven't got all of our crop in yet, but I don't know, I wouldn't say it was that amazing. I'd say it's good, pretty good, definitely good. I definitely wouldn't mind if every spring was like this, but I wouldn't say it was amazing. And I think one of the reasons for that is literally no oilseed rape fields anywhere near my bees. And I've been driving all around my part of Cheshire a lot, as you have to as a beekeeper, and I literally haven't seen one yellow field. And last season it was the opposite. Last season it was all over the place. So obviously it's a kind of rotation crop. So last year was the oilseed rape year, and I think that means I have to wait another year before we get it back again. I don't mind because the honey's delicious, and it was probably, I think there would have been some hawthorn in it and a bit of dandelion, but I imagine the majority of it is kind of tree blossom, and it's good stuff, so I'm happy with that. I haven't got my exact yield yet, but it looks like we're going to get about a ton, so that'll keep me going for a little while, and hopefully we'll get that again, or maybe more, in the summer. Anyway, back to my blog post about myth busting, because there are lots of myths in beekeeping. There's lots of content creators on YouTube and so forth, and there's also lots of beekeeping associations where knowledge is passed by word of mouth, and sometimes that message isn't 100% true, and sometimes it's downright false. But these things get repeated and repeated and become kind of accepted facts. So I've just picked a few out that I thought were worth mentioning. So the first one was the Einstein thing. The old saying that's attributed to Einstein: if the bee disappeared off the surface of the globe, then man would only have 4 years of life left. And there's a tiny kernel of ecological truth in there, but it's grossly oversimplified and unhelpful. And also, Einstein didn't say it, so there's no evidence that Einstein ever made this comment. It didn't appear in his speeches or writings, and it only seems to emerge decades after his death. Apparently, I'm told, first surfacing in French beekeeping circles in the 1990s, not back in the 40s or 50s. So it's basically a safe bet to say that Einstein didn't say that. And when people say bee, they often think honeybee. But there's obviously many species of bees, and it's not all about the honeybee. And lots of people think that honeybees are in trouble, but it's not really the case. It's much more the case that other pollinators need some help. And whereas some people, their motivation maybe for taking up beekeeping is to save the bees and save the world, and so they take up keeping honeybees, very often that's not really the best thing they could do if their goals are to help pollinators. Very often the best thing that you could do is have a patch of land that you let go wild, maybe plant some trees, that kind of thing. Have a pond, have some piles of wood and let them go rotten. Just let nature take over a corner of your land, and the pollinators will arrive along with all sorts of other wildlife, and that's really positive for the environment and for nature, much more so than keeping a few colonies of honeybees, to be honest. But anyway, this thing about if the honeybees go, we're all dead. For a start, large swathes of the planet where honeybees now are managed, then the honeybee isn't native to those areas. For example, the honeybee is definitely not native to the United States. So, things were fine before they arrived, and I suppose theoretically they could be fine after they're gone. And they're having some really horrible losses over there in North America at the moment. I think there's been quite a lot of work done into it, but I don't know if we've 100% got the answer. A lot of people call it the death of 1,000 cuts, where there's lots of little stressors that just add one on top of the other, and basically it just then takes like a tiny extra stressor and the whole thing collapses. I'm not sure. I think from what I've heard, it's a combination of, as always, Varroa and associated viruses, and pesticides that are used in agriculture widely. And if those things are just used heavily and perhaps indiscriminately, the levels can build up in the background, and eventually they start to kick in and mess with nature a bit more than perhaps you'd want it to. But I don't know. We'll find out. Anyway, even though the bees are important pollinators for agriculture, such as almonds and apples, cherries, blueberries, etc., they're not the only pollinators. There's plenty of other pollinators, so it's not just down to the honeybee. And many of the crops that we eat, humans, the carb type crops like wheat, rice, corn, they're wind pollinated or self-pollinating. So, it's pretty sure that if the honeybee disappeared, the human race will be maybe not fine, but certainly won't be wiped out. However, pollinators in general are crucial to the ecosystem, and something like 75% of the crops that are grown benefit to some degree from some form of pollinator. So if we did lose pollinators, it would be much more serious than just losing honeybees. That would reduce yields and the variety of fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds. We'd have to increase our reliance on manual pollination, which is expensive and not very good. And biodiversity would crash, and basically it wouldn't be very good at all. So, but anyway, why does this myth about Einstein saying if the bees die, we're all dead in 4 years? Why does it persist? Basically, it's emotionally powerful, as it links the fate of humans to that of bees, and it fits into a certain environmental narrative. The kind of one that's associated with so-called greenwashing, any research paper. Like, I remember Randy Oliver told me this. In fact, he told it several times, but it's like he gets a lot of research papers to check over before they're published. Lots of researchers contact him and just say, "What do you think, Randy? What do you have? Is this a decent paper?" Because as long as it's to do with honeybees, then he's your man for that. And so many of the introductions to these research papers start with something like, the honeybee is a critical pollinator and it's under enormous threat, and we must do everything we can to save the bee. And he always says if he ever sees that at the beginning of a research paper, he knows that what follows is going to be mostly bullshit, which I thought was quite amusing. But anyway, okay, so there's another myth, but the thing about this myth, it's the one about, to use a Trump word, nasty bees make more honey. And by nasty bees, I mean those little shits that as soon as you take the lid off, they're jumping at you, they're in your face, they're flying up in the air, pinging on your veil. You put your hand across the frames and they jump at your hands and probably sting. Not good. And of course that trait, that defensive trait, makes complete sense from a bee's perspective, because that's how you survive, isn't it? If some animal, some big hairy creature starts rummaging around in your house, it's pretty damn advantageous to the colony to be able to defend it. But from the beekeeper's perspective, it's not what we want. And there is always going to be anecdotal evidence for and against this idea. So there's always somebody who says, I've got some right horrible bees, but they always make the most honey. But equally, there'll be people who say, the opposite. I've either got some lovely bees that make the most honey, or I've got some horrible bees and they don't make much. And there's not much science around this. That I looked at trying to find some scientific papers and research to kind of back up for or against this idea. And most of the research that I could find about defensive colonies is really looking at comparing Africanized honeybees with European honeybees. A long time ago, some African bees were taken over to Brazil to be studied, and they kind of escaped and basically rampaged across Brazil and have moved up through Central America into the southern USA. So-called killer bees have got pretty bad reputation. And as I understand it, some of these Africanized bees have now been kind of bred into being reasonably placid, whereas the others are actually horrible. But nevertheless, that's not what I'm trying to find out. I'm trying to find out, do evil, horrible bees make more honey than nice, chilled out bees? So I found an article called "The Process and Outcome of the Africanization of Honeybees in Mexico, Lessons and Future Directions." If you go to my blog, The Walrus and the Honeybee, and you look up the post, myth busting, you'll find a link in there to anything that I talk about on this podcast. So that's the best way to actually get hold of the paper if you're interested. But anyway, they say in this article that one study showed colonies of primarily African ancestry produce less honey than colonies of primarily European ancestry, and it was 30% less. They also found that hybrids, crosses between African mother and European drones, had lower honey yields than just normal European honeybees. But, interestingly, the other way around, a European honeybee queen crossed with Africanized drones produced slightly more honey than normal European honeybees, which is a sort of side issue, but basically it suggests that honey production as a trait is possibly more determined by the queen than the drones. And as far as I know, the tendency to be defensive is more with the drones than the queens, but I'm not 100% on that, but I'm pretty sure. But anyway, I couldn't find much on the science, but that was something. There was a paper there that showed that, at least as far as Africanized versus European, as in terms of managed colonies in that particular country, the Europeans did better. However, it's a whole different thing when you're looking at wild bees that are just not being managed by beekeepers, and also in different climates. So I believe in Brazil, in the kind of rainforesty type of climate, maybe it's not rainforest but forest, the Africanized bees seem to do really well there, and make more. Well, I guess the Europeans wouldn't last long in those conditions, maybe, I don't know. But the idea that, I guess what we can say, and this is perhaps the most important thing on this idea, the idea that defensive colonies make more money, make more honey, and therefore more money if you're a farmer, is not true. And through selective breeding of honeybee queens, we have been able to separate this defensiveness thing from the productivity thing. So it is perfectly normal and possible to have really, really, really lovely bees that make an absolute ton of honey. And my friend Paul Horton who I co-authored the book Healthy Bees, Heavy Hives with, is proof of that. I mean, he made just unbelievable amounts of honey, something like 30 odd tons from 300 colonies last season, which was a bit of an unusual season, but nevertheless. And his bees are Danish buckfasts, very carefully bred over many, many years. There's several good breeders in that country, and they're careful to avoid inbreeding. They're very careful on crossing different lines in such a way that they're not inbred, that they're currently trying to increase the hygienic behaviours, and they're always very chilled out. Even the crosses, even though, because lots of people say when you get a buckfast bee, that's great, but when that swarms and then the subsequent new queen mates with the local drones, lots of people say, oh, you get evil, horrible bees from that, vicious things, and that has happened to me. Not that I mean, I've got all sorts of bees, and not just, I've got some Danish buckfasts, and I've got some Carniolans, and I've got all sorts. But in general, and I've spoken to Paul about this too with his bees, the next generation tends to be great. Like they're not evil at all, and they're still productive. But then subsequent generations do tend to get a bit more testy, a bit more feisty, and less productive and more swarmy. And my explanation for this is that you're getting further and further away from the original queen, which was a well-bred Danish buckfast. You're actually, by the time you get down to the granddaughters and great-granddaughters, the majority of the genetics of that bee are the local bees, and very often the local bees are, a little bit less forgiving than a buckfast. The only downside, and this isn't anything to do with myths, but I seem to have strayed onto this, the downside with these really gentle buckfasts that I've seen and that I've heard others comment on, is that sometimes they don't supersede. They don't swarm and they don't supersede. They just peter out. Queen gets old, just fizzles out, and then you've got a queenless colony, and they don't even they just die. The other thing is they eat more honey or syrup over winter, or they're more prone to starvation if you get a period of terrible weather and the honey flow stops. So it's not all good, but if you put those bees on a massive crop of oilseed rape or borage or beans or whatever, they will make an absolute, mountain of honey. So, in short, it is a myth that evil bees make more honey than nice bees. Nice bees can make a lot of honey, evil bees can make a lot of honey, and both can also make not much honey. So there is no real correlation between defensiveness and productivity. So there's no excuse. If you've got horrible bees, change the queen. The other thing is leaving bees alone. So when you start beekeeping in the first few years, there's a great desire to kind of root around inside the brood nest, pull out every frame, look at it, wonder at the marvels of the beehive. Oh, look, there's pollen, there's sealed brood, etc. But each time you do that, you do disrupt the bees. And, excuse me, if you don't really know what you're doing and you're clattering around in there, you can really disrupt them more than you need to. You don't actually need to pull out more than 3 frames of brood very often. if that, to know what's going on. But at first you don't know that, and the only way you can really learn is to just go through this. So there is this kind of this thought, this idea that perhaps just leaving the bees alone, not messing with them, nature knows best, all that kind of stuff. Maybe that makes you more honey than all this fiddling around with the bees and constantly messing with them. And what this boils down to really is what they call an intensive beekeeping method or an extensive beekeeping method. So intensive management involves frequent and regular inspections at certain times in the season. So for me, that's kind of April, May, June. Once we get, well, to be honest, even now, because this season's been so early, even now swarming's pretty well over, so I probably won't go in the brood box that much between now and the end of the season. Every now and then it's good to go in there, see what's going on, and certainly to do a disease check a couple of times a year. But in the swarm time, which this year was April and May, you really need to be going in there every 7 to 10 days. Other ideas of intensive management are regular requeening, varroa control, that kind of thing. Basically what I call beekeeping. The extensive, or sometimes I think it might be called natural beekeeping maybe, that method minimises the number of interventions by the beekeeper, so less work for the beekeeper, which means more colonies can be run per beekeeper. But in the main, swarming is not controlled, and that may or may not be a problem, depends on the location. So I read around this topic and comparing the intensive and extensive management. I did a little table which is shown on my blog, but basically there's a number of measures and a comparison between one and the other. So for gross honey yield, it's generally higher with the intensive management than extensive. Colony turnover is more frequent with intensive management and much less so with extensive. But colony turnover means requeening, making splits, that kind of thing. The inputs required are very high with intensive, so that's beekeeping time, medications, sugar syrup, etc. Much lower with the extensive. The resilience of the bees is often lower in intensively managed bees without intervention, so they come to rely on the beekeeper's interventions to survive, whereas with the extensive style, less interventions and the bees look after themselves, and obviously over time they become more resilient. Sustainability, probably higher with extensive than intensive, because with the intensive there's more inputs, so that could eat into profitability and make it less sustainable over time, depending on how lucky you are with the weather and how good a beekeeper you are. And the suitability, so for intensive management, the suitability is more for commercial beekeepers, urban beekeepers, and people focused on honey production as the prime objective of their beekeeping. So you can see that obviously a bee farmer needs to make honey, and an urban beekeeper needs to control swarming, and they need to be therefore making regular inspections, otherwise the bees bugger off and you annoy your neighbours. in the extensive management column, suitable more for hobby beekeepers, ecologists, naturalists. So that's a comparison between them. But anyway, you'll note the top one, gross honey yield, generally higher with intensive than extensive. A lot depends on weather and forage. Anyway, the main purpose of hive inspections are ensuring there's enough space for the queen to lay and for the bees and for honey. So that's three things. The brood nest has to have space for the queen to lay, otherwise they think about swarming. You need space to physically hold the bees, and they can be up to sort of 60,000 bees at their peak. And obviously honey, the more honey they gather, the more space they'll need in the form of supers. Prevention or control of swarming is another reason we inspect, and so if you find queen cells you have to do something. And disease and pests, you need to be on the lookout and act promptly. That's normal beekeeping the intensive way. So you could argue that giving them a large brood box like a Dadant and loads of supers all at once in the spring might deal with the space issue in one hit. And furthermore, if say 30% swarm and they're not in a residential area, kind of who cares really? It might result in lower honey crops, but certainly a lot less cost in terms of beekeeper hours. And one or two inspections a year to look at diseases and pests would cover you off for that. So you can see how an extensive style of beekeeping could be adapted to a kind of commercial setup. And as I understand it, Wainwrights do that. Big beekeeping company over in West Wales with bees all over the country, and they're based in West Wales, and they as I understand it, they run much more along those sort of lines rather than the weekly inspections kind of method. Now for me, I like to raise queens, I like to prevent swarms, I like to control varroa, so for me it's a no-brainer really. I'm more of an intensive bee farmer, but once the swarm season's over, I'm not going to be down in that brood box very often. So that is pretty well what I came up with in that post. So that wasn't really many myths, but the Einstein didn't say it thing. The evil bees don't make more honey, so don't tolerate evil bees. And on the intensive versus extensive management, leaving the bees alone or fiddle around with them, I think it's a balance, and it just depends on what kind of a beekeeper you are and what you want from your beekeeping. But it very definitely is the case that if you're in a urban setting, I wouldn't even keep bees in a garden. If you're in a row of houses and everyone's kind of saying hello to each other over the fence in their gardens, like that kind of environment isn't for bees, I don't think. I mean, people do it, but I just think you're asking for trouble. Someone's going to get stung, someone's going to get a swarm in their apple tree and complain. Bees poop. They'll come and sort of try and drink your neighbour's from the water fountain or swimming pool, and poo all over neighbours' cars or washing. I just think it's an absolute nightmare, and I'm lucky in that I can keep my bees on farms well away from humans, which is the way I like it. Okay, so that's what I came up with on that. Hope you're all having a good season, and for those of you who are extracting, hopefully it doesn't take too long and you get through it and have a nice rest afterwards. For us, once we've finished extracting, we're back to queen rearing. I've just been making a cell builder that's kind of should be ready in about 5 to 7 days. Should be ready for grafts, and then after that we just need the sun to come out so that the queens can get mated. We've got another apiary that we need to tidy up and get the old hedge cutter out and strimmer and set up some hives. And in the middle of all that, I've got to move house, assuming that it doesn't fall through. So I'll be quite busy this summer. And I can't even have my usual end of season holiday in Lanzarote, which we do love, but my dog's quite old now. I've got a beagle. She's 13, and she's kind of like deaf, blind, and seems to even be losing her sense of smell. So we don't think it's fair to chuck her in kennels. So no holidays for us until, well, no holidays in Lanzarote anyway, until she's gone. So that's fair enough. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that, and yeah, have a good rest of the season.